Happy Juneteenth, and thank you for joining me today. This story begins with 7 debates, and they were all held in 7 different towns. And these debates were of so much public interest that tens of thousands of people showed up to them. The whole thing was reenacted in 1994 by C-SPAN. They reenacted what is still viewed today as one of the greatest political debates in American history. I'll make sure to link that in the description of this episode. But this debate was held in 1858 between two senators, State Senator Stephen Douglas and a young Republican politician running to replace him named Abraham Lincoln. The senatorial candidates debated on several matters, but one of the most important matters in the country at the time, one of the most important and crucial issues in the country at the time was, of course, slavery. Lincoln was vehemently opposed to it, while Douglas remained convinced that the issue should be solely left up to the states to deal with. And after all that travel and popping out of windows, Abraham Lincoln, he lost that election. He won the popular vote, but the way you got to office back then was through the state legislature. And so although Lincoln won the majority of the people's votes, the state legislature did not favor him. They did not choose him for office. So that was in 1858. And even though he lost, he had risen to national prominence for those debates. 2 years later, in 1860, there was another election, and both politicians, they squared off again. And this time, it wasn't for an old Illinois Senate seat. It was for the presidency of the United States. In that election, Lincoln emerged victorious, and Douglas didn't even come in second, not even in third, but fourth place with 4% of the electoral vote. This is the Electoral College we're talking about, and Douglas comes in fourth place with 4%. You know how much small and teeny tiny of a fraction that is? Well, Lincoln garnered just 59%. How's that for a political comeback? And that was in part because of slavery. It had become a hotly politically contested issue at the time. The Democratic Party was very divided that year, and so the country elected its first Republican president. Hey, let's give this guy a chance. Between the day Lincoln was elected and sworn in, 7 states were so afraid of his staunch opposition to slavery that they seceded from the Union. And those 7 states didn't just float in the ether as independent territories. No, a nation was formed. It was called the Confederate States of America, with its elected president, Jefferson Davis. And not long after the Civil War began, and just 2 years into office, Abraham Lincoln did something remarkable. On January 1st, 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all slaves in the South liberated. The proclamation by Lincoln also ordered that Black men be allowed to serve in the U.S. Army and Navy. The Civil War ended on April 9th, 1865. The North had won, but the following Sunday, Lincoln was assassinated. And even though the Civil War was over, not all slaves, specifically in the South, knew that they had been freed. I mean, the Emancipation Proclamation was widely known, but of course, there was some distortion and concealing of information to keep this ongoing. So a Union Major General named Gordon Granger set out to personally deliver that message. And so on June 19th, 1865, he arrived in Galveston, Texas, with a force of soldiers to deliver this message. Quote, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection herefore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor." End quote. Some slaves were not immediately freed, but that message had many slaves on cloud 9, essentially. Felix Haywood, a former slave, later said, quote, "Everybody went wild. We all felt like heroes. Just like that, we were free." End quote. So that's why you may have this holiday off as a federal worker, or that's why you may be out celebrating right now at a local Juneteenth commemoration. It's also Father's Day. Happy Father's Day to all of our fathers out there. That is the history of this day. And before this year, Juneteenth, well, essentially before last year, Juneteenth was just acknowledged and celebrated in individual states. Now it is a federal holiday, and thanks to the many of advocates who've been fighting for this for so long. For example, here's the story of a young 12-year-old Black woman named Opal Lee. It was in 1939. Her family had just moved into a new home in a predominantly white neighborhood, this upclass suburban neighborhood. And the realtor told them it would be fine, but it was not. They did they didn't even essentially last a week in that house. What happened to them actually made the local news in eerily disturbing headlines. This one says, quote, Fort Worth crowd attacks Negroes, end quote. The article continues, quote, violence exclaimed observance of Negro emancipation here late tonight when a crowd estimated at 500 persons stormed the residence of Otis Flake at 940 East Annie Street. The men hurled rocks at the house and then entered the dwelling and began carrying furniture into the street after Mr. Flake, his wife, and 3 children fled from the house. Flake moved into the house last Friday. For 4 nights, police had watched the area, attempting to disperse crowds that assembled on a nearby corner in protest to the moving of Negroes into a white residential neighborhood, end quote. Another headline was quoted, Negro driven out, furniture burned, mob evicts blocks from white neighborhood. That reporting was from the United Press, and they said that police were investigating the riot where the violence transpired. Another newspaper reported that the crowd was around 150 people and later dispersed Saturday night. There were also reports of the crowd being 500 people, but the documentation of the destruction essentially just continued. According to police, the mob destroyed furniture, broke windows, and damaged the building. A man was hit with a baseball bat. Youths came into the house, turned on the gas jets, and fled. Even though all that had happened, and this was supposedly under investigation by the local police department, no one was ever really formally held accountable. No one was actually arrested, and on top of that, nothing was ever published about the attack or the investigation, not even the conclusions or the preliminary results from that investigation. Nothing ever happened. One of the 3 children who was in that house, traumatized during that just horrific situation, was Opal Lee. She was only 12 years old when that traumatizing event happened in her life. She was interviewed about it earlier last year by Angelique Jackson at Variety, and she said this, quote, people gathered, the police couldn't control them. My dad came home with a gun, and the police told him if he busted a cap, they'd let the mob have him. If they had given us an opportunity to stay there and be their neighbors, they would have found out we didn't want any more than what they had, a decent place to stay, jobs that paid, to be able to go to school in the neighborhood, even if it was a segregated school. We would have made good neighbors, but they didn't give us an opportunity. And I felt like everybody needs an opportunity, end quote. This terroristic violence happened on Juneteenth. That's what the newspapers were talking about in terms of Negro Emancipation Day. That was in 1939. And Juneteenth has been celebrated as a paid state holiday in Texas since 1979, so for like more than 40 years now. It was the first state to do so, and there have been celebrations of this day in other states as well. But Miss Opal Lee has been fighting for a long time to make this a national holiday beyond just state commemoration of it. After the nation elected the first Black president in 2008, Barack Obama, Miss Lee wrote a letter to him. In 2016, President Obama's last year in office, she decided to go to Washington, D.C. herself, not by car, not even by plane or by train, but she walked. Literally, she walking from Fort Worth, Texas, all the way to the nation's capital, along with supporters. She was 89 years old when she did this and planned to come with a petition of approximately 100,000 signatures. But she didn't get that. She got 1.5 million signatures instead as of September 2020. Although she was unsuccessful, she nevertheless persisted. In February of 2021, the legislation to make Juneteenth a national holiday was reintroduced, and just recently, the Senate passed it unanimously, just last year. In the U.S. House of Representatives, of course, although I should mention, the bill passed 415 to 14. 14 white Republican men apparently don't think commemorating the end of slavery is a good thing. That will forever be their legacy. 14 white men, Republican, don't think commemorating slavery is a good idea. I mean, commemorating the end of it. But of course, altogether, the vote in the party was pretty overwhelming, Democrats and Republicans making this a bipartisan commemoration of ending slavery.